an amazing lineup of speakers, starting with Commissioner Sinkevicius, who will open this event. He will be followed by IEEP Associate Alan Buckwell, who will present the preliminary outcomes of our study. Then we have a distinguished panel, including Sandrine de Clèves, MEP Paul Tang, and Aldo Ravatzi Duvan, who will then discuss key issues related with environmental fiscal reform in the EU. As Sandrine will have to leave before the end of the event, she will be replaced by another distinguished Club of Rome member, Ernst von Weizsäcker. So in terms of how to make sure that this event is as interactive as we can, you will be able to ask questions to the panelists. You can use the QA feature as well as the chat to react and share insights. What's amazing is we also have authors of the study online, as well as staff from DG Environment and TaxSud, who are online and able to answer the questions. Given the number of participants today, if we run out of time, we will record the most popular questions and publish a Q&A after the session. If you want to be tweeting, use the hashtag #GreenTaxation. And I also want you to know that the event is being live streamed on IEEP's YouTube channel. And to close with, we're also very happy that we will have Gerasimos Thomas from TaxSud to provide closing remarks. And we're really, really also grateful for his presence, as he will be able to provide us with an update on the hot tax files, such as the Energy Tax Directive and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. But without further ado, let me first introduce Commissioner Sinkevicius, Commissioner for Environment, Ocean and Fisheries, with a distinguished career as a minister in his country for economy and innovation in Lithuania. Before that, a member of parliament. And I also see that the commissioner in his past life worked like me for a think tank. So welcome, Commissioner. Very excited to hear your keynote remarks.
Good morning. It's, of course, my pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm here, but I cannot start my video. Yes, because the host is not allowing me to start my video, but now finally, yes, I'm here.
Now we can see you, we still cannot hear you.
No sound?
Which is strange because it worked 10 seconds ago.
We can hear him.
Can you hear me?
Still not, I'm sorry.
Yes, I can hear you.
We can hear him, so it's only me.
Okay.
That's even better. Okay, go ahead, Commissioner.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay. No, that's fine. Again, a very good morning to everyone. I hope that most of you can hear me. Of course, on behalf of the Commission, good morning to you all and welcome to the conference. It sounds so obvious, making polluters pay for the damage they do. Unfortunately, we have to admit ourselves that it rarely happens. We legislate, but most pollution is still for free. The polluters do not pay. And society bears the damage cost. And today we'll look at why that happens and what we can do to change it. EU tax instruments usually focus on addressing specific problems. This is partly because we need unanimity in the decision-making process, and it is easier to agree if the scope is narrow and well-defined. Yet the polluter pays principle could be implemented by taxing pollution. Citizens expect their concerns about their health, about the environment to be taken seriously. They expect fairness and prefer that the taxes they pay are used to invest in the future rather than to fix the damage of the past. And therefore, we cannot afford to leave this subject matter unaddressed. In their responses to the pandemic, member states are taking unprecedented measures to keep their economies afloat. We are all in crisis management, but we also need to keep structural reforms in mind. Future-proof tax reforms should address much more than the immediate emergency. They need to factor in climate change, environmental degradation, digitalization, and the aging of the population. As noted in the Green Deal, it's time for member states to shift taxes from labor to pollution. This is necessary to ensure long-term sustainability. The Commission is playing its part at EU level to support the move toward the greening taxation. We announced a revision of the Energy Taxation Directive and of the emission trading scheme, and we will soon propose a carbon border adjustment mechanism. These proposals will be adopted in the first half of this year. But carbon pricing is only one part of the equation. We need much broader reforms. It's a challenge because the budgetary revenues needed for public spending have to be fair in terms of their social impact. It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, a chance to revise the current fiscal framework and put the polluter pays principle into practice. Europe has ambitious goals to fight climate change and environmental degradation. Achieving those goals will depend on changing our behavior. In simple terms, green taxation is an excellent way to discourage pollution and to nudge people into more sustainable patterns of producing and consuming. The polluter pays principle is embedded in the EU treaties. Prices are a signal to producers and consumers. They can nudge people and businesses to go beyond legislation. But apart from the Energy Taxation Directive and emissions trading, there are still no rules on harmonized environmental taxes at EU level. Some environmental legislation refers to the use of price signals as part of the policy instrument that can help reach environmental targets. The Water Framework Directive is one example, introducing a requirement for cost recovery. Another relevant case is the EU waste legislation, which sets policy targets in terms of recycling and requires member states to use economic instruments and other measures to ensure that waste is properly managed. And this will be reinforced in the next EU budget through the own resource component based on non-recycled plastic packaging waste. So there are some examples and they work very well, but we are far from setting clear incentives to pollute less. The natural question to come here is, where do we stand in the EU? Because around 50% of total tax revenue still come from labor taxes and social contributions. Last year, less than 6% of EU 27 tax revenues came from environmental taxes. That's less than 2.5% of GDP. Total revenue from these taxes rose, but their share of GDP actually fell. Around 4/5 of that revenue is energy taxation. The second highest share is transport taxes. Only 3% of environmental taxes are taxes on pollution and resources. So it's clear where the opportunity lies. In a moment, Alan Buckwell will share the preliminary findings of a study carried out by IEEP for the Commission on behalf of the European Parliament. I don't want to steal his thunder, so I won't elaborate on it a lot. But there is one finding I want to highlight. The study clearly strengthens the case for shifting the focus away from income and towards pollution and resources. It also shows that the shift would be good for growth and that it can be done in an inclusive way. And there are good examples out there already. You have probably heard about the spectacular success of the Irish plastic bags tax. Ireland introduced a 15 € tax on plastic shopping bags in 2002. Now 22 €. Previously, bags were free, and the effect was spectacular. A reduction in use of around 90% with a dramatic drop in littering. In 2018, that tax generated €9 million. The administrative costs are low, around 3% of revenue, because reporting is integrated into the existing system of for VAT. And the public response has been overwhelmingly positive. That high rate of acceptance is largely due to careful consultations with stakeholders before adoption, a principle we need to remember. There are many other good examples. Some are simple, like deposit refund schemes. Others are more innovative, but offer more in the future, such as pesticides or nutrient taxes. So the question naturally comes, why it's not happening more widely, and partly I think because of inertia in the system. Member states often hesitate before addressing these issues in a systemic way. Fiscal reforms happen often bit by bit, and it's a rare for the whole system to get the overall in needs. Some argue that environmental taxes are regressive and hit lower income groups the hardest. But there are many ways to limit that possibility with exemptions, tax credit allowances and deductions, and there is a very good case for looking at things the other way around. The underprivileged and the vulnerable are actually the people who are hit hardest by environmental problems like air pollution. So when we reduce pollution through pricing instruments, we reduce the risk of to the health of the vulnerable, and we spend the revenue in a fairer way. We do need systemic change. The goal is a long-term switch to a low-carbon, resource-efficient, nature-friendly economy. What we need is forward-looking tax system that pulls us in that direction. So what can we do in practice? Most taxes are the responsibility of member states. We need to encourage them on the road to fiscal reform, and we need to support them along the way. We can follow developments through the European semester and the environmental implementation review. And there is a good opportunity for introducing fiscal reform in the shape of the resilience and recovery plans. I'm very pleased to see that some member states, including Portugal and Slovakia, have already included a broad environmental tax reform in the resilience and recovery plans. Many more are considering carbon taxes. There may be a need to develop knowledge and expertise at various levels of government, including on the design of reforms. Exchanges of experience between member states will help, but EU expertise should also be upgraded to create effects at scale. A toolbox developed as part of the IEEP study can help member states engage in tax reform. The Commission provides support for structural reforms in a broad variety of policies, including tailor-made technical support and support through organizations like the World Bank, the OECD, member state agencies, and the private sector. The next EU budget will also include a technical support instrument with similar capacities. And of course, later on today, Taxud Director General Gerasimos Thomas will be showing us what to expect in the taxation area in the near future. So clearly, we all want a greener future. Surveys show that only very few people do not share the awareness that we need to embark on a more sustainable path. But this green future needs to be built, and to do that, we need the right tools. A price on pollution is a powerful lever. We need to take that lever out of the toolbox and use it wisely in the places where it can really tip the balance. We can build on the wealth of good examples at hand. Let's study them carefully today and strengthen our resolve to use them more widely. Let me thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner, for this really inspiring speech and about telling us all the opportunities we have to put on price on pollutions. And after this really great start to our conference, I'd like to turn to Alan Backwell. Alan has been with IEP for quite some time. Since 2012, he's a distinguished agricultural economist. He's worked in many places, Newcastle University, the Y College. He's also had a stint in DG Agri. And he will present the preliminary results of the study that we have conducted for DG Environment on behalf of our consortium, which includes many different organizations, Eunomia, CE Delft, Cambridge Econometrics, and more to come. Obviously, we will be publishing the final report in the next few months. And we have also a number of events dedicated to zoom in on specific issues, but also to help and empower civil society and other stakeholders at member state to pursue environmental fiscal reform. So Alan, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Celine, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to participate in this event and to summarize some of the key outcomes of the research that has emerged from, or is emerging from, this project. As Celine says, the project is still underway. We expect to finalize this spring. This is a project involving 13 participants, and a number of them are online if you have questions about some of the specifics. The study set out to do 3 or 4 things. A key task was to try and estimate the scale of the environmental damage that we're seeking to deal with and to internalize through taxation, or at least partially. And we particularly wanted to try and estimate the extent to which this damage is already being internalized through the use of pollution taxes and market-based instruments. You'll see MBI appear various points in this presentation. That's our acronym for other market-based instruments. So that was the first task: how much damage and how much is internalized. A second task was to specifically look at this question of the impact of green taxation on the general economy and the distributional impact, because plainly these are concerns that people raise when we talk about green taxes. So that was a second task, to look at the impacts on growth, jobs and fairness. The third big task that has taken a great deal of time and effort is to systematically look through sector by sector, member state by member state, on which of the areas, on which of the environmental issues in each member state are the most promising candidates, and which would be the most helpful green taxes to work on first, to try and help the process of member states and stakeholders understanding how to make progress in designing these new taxes and instruments and getting them in place. And then the final stage is trying to provide some practical toolkit to make it available for stakeholders in the member states to help stimulate discussions and actions on these taxes. Of course, the policy context for this work is the pledge that we made in Europe in the way back in 2011 in the Resource Efficiency Roadmap to increase environmental taxes to at least 10% of public revenues on average by 2020. Well, as the Commissioner has already said, that we haven't done spectacularly well on this, and at present a bit less than 6% of revenues are from environmental taxes. And as he said, most of these are focused in just 1 or 2 sectors. So there's a good deal more progress to be made here. I mean, clearly we're missing an opportunity here, that we can raise tax revenues sustainably and in a way which corrects the distortions in price signals in the economy, and therefore lead to better achievement of environmental goals. Now, in the study, the analysis, it's quite a big piece of work, this. We looked at 5 environmental themes: air, water quality, water stress and availability. That was the third one. The fourth one is biodiversity and land use. And the 5th area was waste and the circular economy. And the analysis was done across 6 economic sectors and for each member state. As I said, our first task was to try and get a feel for the magnitude of the pollution costs in each of those 5 environmental themes. And I'm going to take you through the results for just 2 of the themes. That's air pollution and water pollution. So here's a summary of the results for air pollution. The estimates that we came out with was just over 700 billion annual costs of air pollution in the EU 27, of which we estimate that about 44% of those air pollution costs are currently internalized through various instruments. When you break that down by sector, we first of all see that 5 of the sectors, energy, industry, households, agriculture, transport, they, roughly speaking, contribute similar sort of orders of magnitude of pollution costs. That's the light blue bars. But when you look at the dark blue bars, which is the extent to which those costs are internalized through existing instruments, The answer is it's miserable in all of the sectors except households. And in fact, households are probably paying more, they're over-internalized, as we might say, they're paying more than the costs of the pollution that they're directly causing. So there's a good deal further to go. Incidentally, just for background, that's 700 billion of total cost of air pollution. About 56% of it is greenhouse gases. The other 44% is air pollution, of which nitrogen oxides is a significant part, about a fifth. 90% of those costs are health costs, and as the Commissioner says, they fall unevenly across the population. If we then look at the within those EU figures at the performance across the member states in internalising air pollution, we see tremendous variation from 5 or 6 countries who are below 20% of the air pollution costs internalised, and a few that stand out as internalising the majority. There's Finland and Sweden on the extreme right of this diagram, Netherlands, Italy, others are other countries doing approximately 70%. But it has to be noted that in the Finnish and Swedish cases, these are not big polluters anyway. The bigger polluters, I'm afraid, are internalising less of the costs of their air pollution. So that's a story on air pollution. Turning to water pollution, the total costs here are of a different order of magnitude, smaller. About 22 billion euros is the estimate of the water pollution costs across the EU 27. And we can see that that's the light blue bar. And we can see that the internalized portion of that is extremely low. And in fact, for non-point water pollution, which is the majority, there's almost no internalization. So this is plainly an area where considerably more can be done. Looking at the how the member states are achieving on water pollution, the story is that most are doing nothing. And that even the best of them, France in this case, is managing to internalize only just over 2% of the costs of water pollution in that member state. So that was a sort of taster of the first task in looking at the scale of the task to be done and how far we've made progress. But I mean, the positive to take out of that is that there is good practice taking place and efforts taking place in some countries. There are lessons to be drawn from that. The second big task I want to summarize is where we tried to analyze the macroeconomic impact of switching labour taxes to pollution taxes and other market-based instruments. And this was done by using a global macroeconomic model, E3ME. The data was based on 1970 to 2016, and then results projected through to 2050. And the concept was to switch a portion of the total tax of labour taxes, and we just chose on the figure of 30 billion euros worth of labour taxes, to switch these into green taxes and market-based instruments. And then to measure the impact of that on GDP and on jobs. And the results were that it led to an increase in gross domestic product by 35 billion, 0.2% by 2030, and raised employment in the region of 140,000 full-time equivalents, about 0.1%. Now, this was a marginal change of taxation from labour to green taxes, but the point is that the impact of that is in the direction, a positive direction of stimulating the economy, not suppressing it as some fear, and raising employment. And what's also important is that we looked at the distributional impacts of that. And what the results show is that, contrary to the belief that green taxes can be regressive, our simulation showed positive or zero impacts on income across all sections of income in all member states. And of course, an even more positive distributional effect can be achieved through the design of the taxes and the market-based instruments, and of course, the use to which the revenues are deployed. So that the distributional issues, of course, are important, but they can be positive, is the result of this analysis. And so we think this is an important part of building the case to shift taxation, is that it can be good for the economy, for jobs, and for distributional effects. So the key then is to help the member states and stakeholders in the member states to draw on these sorts of analyses and this sort of evidence. And so a significant part of the next task that we were involved in was to look member state by member state on how best to design green taxes for the different circumstances in each member state. So to look in much more detail about what to tax and how to set the tax rates, who to tax and who to exempt, how to make sure the tax is collected, and how to ensure that they're fair and that vulnerable groups are protected. So of course, the next step is then making all this come into being, making it happen. And the contributions that we're offering towards this, in addition to the evidence that we're providing, are first of all technical workshops on instrument design, and stakeholder workshops for groups in civil society in the member states to encourage greater participation in building this agenda of shifting taxation. And we're certainly looking forward to this process is going to be supported by the Commission, by DG Reform. So in conclusion then, this piece of work shows very clearly that air and water pollution are substantially underpriced, as is environmental damage in other sectors. And that although understandable, the reservations about tackling pollution by using green taxes and market-based instruments are not well founded. And so this is an important part of the contribution. The Green Deal and the Recovery Package, of course, are the key opportunity to do something about this. It's very important that we set that these messages have been determined at the highest political level, and the task now is using the results of this project and the Commission's offer of technical support to help the member states to take concrete steps on this. Plainly, it's time to act. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alan, for this super clear presentation of a very complex issue. And thank you for all that are participating. I see a lot of really insightful comments in the chat, as well as the Q&A about, redistribution, subsidiarity, behavioral change. So I'm sure there will be lots of food for thought for our distinguished panel. So I'm very happy to introduce our three panelists, and I will say, actually, it's four, and you will see why I'm saying this. So we will start with Sandrine Dixon-Declève, and I'm sorry for MEP Polteng for not following the protocol, because Sandrine has to leave before the end. So I hope that's all right with you. Sandrine Declève is currently the co-president of the Club of Rome, and she has many different other roles, such as her role on ECR, the expert group on economic and social impact of research in innovation for DG RTD. Then we will have Paul Tang, who has been a serving member of the Parliament since 2014, and we're very fortunate to have him here because he's the chair of the Tax Committee, And obviously, he used to be before a member of parliament in the Netherlands. He has a doctorate in economic sciences. So clearly, we want to hear also from him. And we also then want to hear from Aldo Ravatzi Duvan. He's an economist. He currently works as an economic advisor in the Italian parliament. He's also the president of Green Budget Europe. And he has also a very distinguished career at the international level, having played key roles in terms of the G7, the Italian presidency in 2017, also having a key role in the team for COP21, but most importantly, having been a chair of the OECD tax committee for years. And then when Sandrine leaves, we'll have also Ernst von Weizsäcker, the co-chair of the International Resource Panel and the co-president of the Club of Rome, who will be there to answer questions. And apart from the fact that he used to be the director of IEEP, he's also written a book on ecological tax reform. So really a great set of thinkers and people who know a great deal about the topic. So without further ado, we'll start with short introductory remarks, 3 to 5 minutes, and I will keep you to time, panelists, and then we will be answering questions from the audience. So Sandrine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here, Céline, to discuss this really, I would say, crucial question of how do we truly now both make the polluter pay, but integrate it into what I would call the new context. I think it's very important as we move forward and we think about this toolkit and its applicability now within the recovery programs across Europe, that we bring in the systems approach. We cannot move forward, and in fact, we've already had several questions in the chat, without thinking about income distribution, exactly as Alan has indicated, at the same time as we look at environmental taxation. And I really applaud the toolkit approach, but I would also urge that we get our heads around how are we finally going to communicate this? How are we finally going to work in terms of demonstrating to people that actually the approach we're taking is a holistic approach? Otherwise, we will continue to have issues around the Gilets jaunes. And part of that has to be how we seize this opportunity of tapping into the post-COVID conversation and consciousness of what is essential. If you look at the well-being paper that we actually recently published, which actually builds also on Come On, which was a very important piece of work built on all of the 50 years of experience that the Club of Rome has put forward around the limits to growth, around shifting from GDP and new economic indicators, we need to think about measuring what matters. And that means that as we move forward and we talk about environmental taxation, we bring in to our people, but also to policymakers, the importance of looking at reshifting, rethinking GDP growth, because it all comes back to the mix between people, planet, and prosperity, and the way in which we unpack those tensions. So shifting taxation from labor to products is fundamental, but then ensuring that we continue with thinking about the timeline of how we do that, the phase in, phase out. I take examples, for example, of where taxation has worked very well in Europe. When we shifted from very high sulfur fuels into low sulfur fuels, and we use the taxation process to create that shift. But we also explained to people that fuel would not actually cost more at the pump, that they would get cleaner fuel and yet pay the same price of what they paid with dirty fuel. So finding that balance is fundamental. The next is to properly explain that actually the taxation system is also trying to support people in their daily lives, that it is clearly going to put a cost on externalities, valuing what matters, but by the same token, that through a series of other mechanisms, funding mechanisms through the just transition, we are enabling countries to be able to shift to decarbonization within industry and really shift into new green industrial zones that will create employment for people. So I think what's incredibly important at this time is balancing the loss of livelihood and the fear that so many people have now post-COVID, that economically they're going to struggle, with bringing in these new tax mechanisms, taxing inheritance, for example, ensuring that we're creative in thinking about new taxes. What about a bit tax, which was actually proposed and come on, which looks at the way in which we transfer information and we tax that information, which also would then make all of those huge ICT companies accountable in terms of where they're putting their taxes and how they're actually propping up the social system. We also need to ensure that we earmark our funds within the recovery funds to complement what other taxation policies that we have in place, and go even broader in terms of this creative thinking, and think about how we can also create a system that looks at global balancing of not only taxation externalities, but looking at, for example, debt, sovereign debt, and how we also shift that debt in order to enable for developing countries, southern countries, to also shift at the same pace as us. Because if we start to put in place polluter pays principles, and if we start to put in place the right taxation system here in Europe, we very much need to figure out what are then the ramifications with regard to our trade, the ramifications with regard to impacts not only on people here, but people outside of Europe. So I would urge that any thinking around taxation brings in the people, planet, prosperity dimension. This is obviously, as you know, Céline, as you sit also on our expert group in GG Research and Innovation, looking at the economic and societal impacts of innovation, that we really think through where those tensions are, that we don't burn ourselves once again by putting up certain taxes and then having massive riots in the streets because people feel that, again, shifting to an environmentally balanced economy is only going to be one that privileges the rich and not necessarily the poor. So I'm going to end on that because I feel that at this crucial time, as we come out of COVID, hopefully very soon, it's absolutely imperative that we get this right. But it is the moment, and we've seen the statistics. People do realize that we have to do things differently. So my urge is not just talking about environmental taxation or green taxation, but a shift within our economy that brings in the people, planet, prosperity element and truly has a holistic approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandrine, and I couldn't agree more with you that this project and this event needs to be set in a larger holistic approach to tax reform. As a French person, I think it's important not to learn the wrong lessons from the Gilets jaunes. There are other member states who have successfully conducted tax reform and introduced, and we've seen this from the presentation from Alan, who have managed to internalize costs because they did so in a way that people thought this was fair and they could see their interest in it. They thought about what you just said, people, planet, and prosperity together. So thank you again. And now I will give the floor to our next speaker, MEP Paul Tang, who will give us his view as the legislative power in the EU and in charge of the tax committee. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here. For those who listen and view this meeting, the tax or fiscal committee, as we call it, has just started, and we started by addressing the holes in the tax system. That includes, for example, tackling tax avoidance, making sure that corporates pay their fair share. It includes taxation in a digital economy, because especially in a digitalized economy, the tax burden on corporates is far from even. Think about Google and Facebook. But also one of the reports will be on a sustainable tax system, and it's a rather complex title, but it shows that sustainability is not just greening. It's about environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. That's the rather complex title, but it shows that in the European Parliament, the emphasis is very much on sustainability and, in fact, on fairness. Let me explain that a bit, and I think it was also illustrated by a slide by Alan Buckwell, where the external costs of air pollution are shown, whether they are internalized or not. Most of the external costs of air pollution are not internalized, except for the households. They are even over-internalized. And this shows at this stage we are still in a very unequal situation where the households bear the brunt of the adjustments, and the corporates are, to differing degrees, are exempt from that. And this is, well, I think one of the major problems that we face. We say that we need to enshrine the polluter pay principle, but in reality it is of course not. But the good thing in that, from this research, but I also saw research in the Netherlands this week, and that there is some form of double dividend. If we shift away from labor taxes towards environmental taxes, it's possible to have an increase in output in let's say in ordinary GDP, and I think that's important because politicians will be concerned whether the shift towards environmental taxation will be economically sustainable. What will it imply for the competitiveness of European firms? And this research, also other research, show that a double dividend is not a theoretical concept. It can be real. Of course, crucial in that also is that we get the emission trading system working, but that we also introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that is an essential part to making sure that the European firms have at least a level playing field when competing on the European market. And I think that is essential to really make the ETS system work, and in this way internalize the cost of climate change. I now come to sustainability in the sense of social and fairness. And there it is important indeed that you make sure that the tax reform, because that's what it is not regressive. And that is not just in monetary terms, it's also in the timing of actions. I think we will lose quickly popular support if we ask from ordinary people to reduce the intake of meat, to change the heating in their house, to fly less, while at the same time they live in a country still where we have coal-fired power plants, and for example the steel industry still is exempted from the emission trade system and still freely allocated emission rights. That will feel, why do I need to adjust and the others don't? So the timing, the order in which we take this is also very important. At the same time, there is, as this research showed or other research shows, there is a double dividend, and that allows us also to target, to make sure to target the effects on the income distribution, and to make sure that everyone benefits from this shift away from labor taxation towards to environmental taxation. So I think that's crucial, and in a sense, in that sense, I come to echo the words by Sandrine, which of course it's people, planet, profit. We need to have this broad view, and I think we also need to think about broad reforms. Piecemeal reforms will make sure there are resistance, that one sector, let's say agriculture or energy, will come into resistance. So we need to have broad reforms so that we can show that it's the burden of adjustment is carried by all, and is also distributed in a fair, equal way. Now, this also implies that we need to rethink policy and policy making. Like I said, the tax systems that we have in Europe, but the same is true outside Europe, are full of holes and inconsistency, but it is more generally true for policy making. So now, what we try to do in the European Union, and very much promoted by the European Parliament, is to make sure that also policy making live up to the standards that we have. And I think the taxonomy should be very helpful in that, to show where policy falls short and needs to be improved. In that taxonomy, there's also enshrined the do not significant harm principle, and that encompasses the broad concept of sustainability. So it cannot be it's not just about greening the economy, it's about making our economy and society sustainable, and that's always a broader concept. So we have to find ways in which a policy proposal or policy action does not just improve the environment, but is also socially and economically sustainable, that it fits into the idea of fairness. So in that sense, I already said, I echo the words of Sandrine, please take a broad view of sustainability. It's not just about greening the tax system, and make sure that we have broad reforms. And the research today shows that there are possibilities, and I think it's also the time to reap this, to take this opportunity, since we are in the middle of, we will come to a recovery where we see huge public spending, and this is an opportunity to make sure that with this public spending, there is also a reform of in tax system that makes our economy and our society more sustainable. In that sense, that the COVID crisis is demanding, but and then again, it's also an opportunity for change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tang, for uplifting our spirits in this really tough period we are with the COVID crisis, to make us realize that it does also present some opportunities, as you say, and the need for really focusing on double dividends and also on broad reform. That's certainly music to my ears. I also want to continue and encourage all the participants from continuing to ask questions and filling in the chat. I see lots of really, really interesting remarks, so I'm sure our conversation will be very interesting. But before that, we will turn now to Aldo. As I said, Aldo has both the international side, but also the member state side. And I know that he's deeply also involved in the thinking about how Italy can face this particular challenge. So Aldo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Celine. My first remark is that some experts pretend that environmental taxes are distorting the market. And I'm quite surprised, because I'm afraid that it is exactly the contrary. Environmental taxes correct the market. They internalize externalities. They help us to have an economy which is more efficient and an environment which is more efficient at the same time. My second remark is that we should remind that the fiscal system have different functions. Not only they internalize externalities when they can, as is often forgotten, I must say, by traditional economists like me, but they also have a function of reorienting consumption, production, and investment. This is another important aim that we have when we think to fiscality and taxation. This is why I'm glad that the European Commission and IEEP are back to work hard on the issues of environmental taxes and greening the fiscal system. In the last 15 years as Green Budget Europe, we have tried to contribute at European and national level to the policy making and the policy decisions on these matters. May I also remind that we have, I think, a strong support from the scientific and research community. Let me quote the call of 300 American economists on carbon dividends and of 1,800 European economists on carbon pricing, thanks to the European Association of Environmental Economists. Now, the results of this new study presented today are very encouraging. May I say that on the macroeconomic impact developed by IEEP and Cambridge Econometrics, we have strong convergence with macroeconomic studies developed in Italy, namely by the Italian Catalogue of Environmentally Harmful Subsidies and Environmentally Friendly Subsidies, by researcher Molocchi with a cost-benefit approach, and recently by Prometeia, the think tank in Bologna. As Commissioner Sinkevicius reminded, the European Commission is supporting countries in the frame of structural reforms, and Italy has proposed a project which is called Advancing Environmental Fiscal Reform in Italy and in the European Union, which has been entrusted to OECD. You mentioned that I have been for many years a co-chair of the Environment and Taxation Committee at OECD, and we look forward for these results, sponsored, financed by the European Commission, proposed by Italy. It might be an instrument that other countries may think at. Now, one key element I see is that we have to make a link to harmful subsidies. We have useful work at OECD, at IMF, at World Bank. We've been working on that at the European Union institutions with the European Environmental Agency. Whatever is the definition and scope, what we call in Italy environmentally harmful subsidies, and is the definition by OECD that we have adopted, what the French call recently subventions nocives, nuisibles à l'environnement, or what some American analysts call perverse subsidies. Now, it might be fossil fuel subsidies, which are the core part of environmentally harmful subsidies and have some commitments at the G20, at the G7, and even at European level, or they might be also in the definition of biodiversity harmful subsidies and incentives, as we have in the frame of the CBD, the International Agreement on Biodiversity, the Convention on Biodiversity with its Aichi targets. This is important because we can build on international commitment. On green tax reform, each member country in the European Union can certainly act alone, unilaterally, but certainly acting together with other European countries makes it easier and makes it more effective. We have a ghost in the attic, which was quoted by the Commissioner, the unanimity role on taxation. I think we have to work all together to reform it. But at the same time, in the meanwhile, intermediate approaches are available. I'm thinking to enhance cooperation in the EU language, but also coalition of the willing or like-minded countries can work together. Then in each country we have to understand if it is preferable to work inside in the frame of a general tax reform, like Ireland and Portugal did, for example, or if we need a specific ecological tax reform. Certainly, if we work together, we can reinforce one another. Now, the traditional approach to environmental fiscal reform has been one of revenue neutrality. We have proposed that also for a problem of political acceptance and public opinion acceptance. But let me remind that the shift from labor and company taxation to natural resources and pollution taxation works also in countries who decide to abate the fiscal burden. And it works also in countries or in a union where we have to finance the Green Deal, the recovery and resilience national plans, or if we have to abate accumulated public debt. Tax reform, which is green, is key for achieving these objectives. My final point to close is that I'm afraid that without market-based instruments, without green tax reforms, we will not achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement on Climate and the United Nations SDGs. So we are at the center of the agenda, and thank you to the European Commission and IEEP for pushing this forward.
Very much. Thank you very much, Aldo, for giving us this really interesting point of view, both, as I said, from the Italian level and also reminding us that without tax reform, we will not be able to implement the Paris Agreement, which begs the question about how also, if we are successful in Europe, we work with other countries, we cooperate so that the shift to a new taxation model doesn't stop at the borders of Europe. Otherwise, we will probably fall short of many of our objectives. So thanks a lot for those amazing first presentations. Could I ask all the panelists as well as Ernst to put their camera live so we can now get to the question time. So I have lots of questions from attendees. I will try to give them to you in 3 batches, and I will allow you to, focus on the ones that you think are the best for you to answer. So in batch 1, there's a first question about, given the limited role of the EU in taxation issues, subsidiarity, well, for many issues, transnational taxation actually seems to be the necessary route. So in that context, what can the EU do to create the possibility to do that shift? So both in this case at the EU level, but also critically at the member state level. Then there are quite a number of remarks about a potential tension between raising environmental taxes to increase revenue, and God knows we will need that in the wake of COVID, versus using them to reduce pollution and to change behavior. Is there a contradiction there? Is there a dilemma? And if you think there is a dilemma, what would be your recommendation about how to address it? So who wants to kick off with some answers?
Before we go, can I ask the host to unlock the video, at least for the panelists? Yes,
sorry, Ernst. Your video is probably locked, but we'll do that in a second. Who wants to start answering any of those questions? Paul?
Yeah, on the question on the European role in taxation, I think that's a relevant question. And I saw this week Olaf Scholz, the German Minister of Finance, again making a passionate plea for majority voting in taxation. And now this is, of course, a very contentious issue. When it is brought to the Council, to the member states, let's say the discussions are not easy. Still, I think that that doesn't mean that there is not any progress possible, because we all, the member states, all are in the same position and face the same problems. So we have a common interest to start with, and it could be very well possible to reach consensus. But this is why I also pointed in my contributions to other possibilities for leverage and to change the policy debate throughout Europe. The first is the Recovery and Resilience Fund. I think that we want to commission to assess the plans that are put forward on sustainability in the broader sense and the instruments that the member states bring. So I would think that the Commission is in a very good position to take up this challenge and bring it also to the member states. This is why I'm optimistic in that sense. I think there's a political opportunity, and we should take full use of this opportunity. And the second thing is that we need to, but while assessing it, I brought back the taxonomy. I think that can be a very powerful instrument also in policy making. We now see areas which I find really incomprehensible. For example, take the discussion on agriculture. I understand all the difficulties and the sensitivities in that, but you can also, like Aldo is saying, we know that it won't live up to the Paris Agreement, and this is exactly what the taxonomy will show. That we need, let's say, some green policies and green investment, and the taxonomy is helping us to show whether it is or it is not, and whether it lives up to the Paris Agreement. And this is where I see the role of the European Commission and also of the European Parliament. Try to put the pressure for these for changes by showing where policies currently fall short. And to take and there are already specific recommendations from the European Commission that the member states need to take into account. But then again, it will be a political battle, because we know that some of the policy actions that for example, abolishing the subsidies that we still have on fossil fuel, it will trigger protest. And then again, that's why we need a broader view to show that the burden of adjustment is not just on one sector, and that it's okay. Please.
Thank you very much, and indeed, thank you also for mentioning the thorny issue of environmentally harmful subsidies, which I know is a debate that will be hitting up as part of the discussion of the 8th EAP about what is the actual timeline by which the European Union wants to get rid finally of those after so many trials, either at the EU level or at the OECD or IMF, because clearly, as you say, how do you reform this within a larger setting is quite key to success. But the good thing, and I must say that we have online case studies from, I think 40 case studies from environmental fiscal reform, which show that it is indeed possible. But thanks a lot, Paul. Ernst, we can now see you on camera. Or Aldo, who wants to take the issue about the potential tension between raising tax to increase revenue versus using tax to change behavior? Aldo?
Well, I think it's nice to hear Ernst, who has been our guru on environmental taxation.
So, Ernst.
I used to be a member of parliament in Germany and was one of the initiators of a green tax reform in Germany. And there, indeed, we lowered the overall tax burden while increasing energy taxes. And the result in terms of economic affairs was that some 300,000 jobs were either saved or created by the ecological tax reform. So the motive can be lowering taxes while increasing green. So that is a useful thing. And I'm very grateful to Paul saying that the sustainability criterion must be respected. And that relates to a large extent to what Aldo was saying about the need to reduce those harmful subsidies. They typically are meant for a certain clientele, chiefly agriculture, you know, but also others, which are totally counterproductive. And we have to at least rebalance that. Let me make one more remark. I was in the China Council directly reporting to the Prime Minister in China as chairman of a group for economic instruments for energy efficiency and the environment. And there we proposed a gradual increase of taxes in proportion to the documented efficiency increases. So the overall money to be paid would not rise year by year by year. No, it would be in parallel with the documented efficiency increases. So nobody would suffer except for the very slow ones. So it's a permanent incentive, in particular addressing investors. I'm also glad that Aldo mentioned the investors as one actor that is extremely important in redirecting technological progress.
If I may, Celine, on the
Yeah, go on, Aldo.
On the tension on raising environmental taxes, obviously we don't like to pay taxes in general, unless they're useful for something, so we have to justify them. And at the same time, the tension can be decreased if we decrease other taxes, which are more distorting the market. So, for example, in Italy there is some work at public and private level in research to understand if we can abate labor taxes, income taxes, on our work, our monthly salaries. This would be extremely communicative, probably. And at the same time, I'm not so scared about the possibility that using efficiently environmental taxes would reduce the environmental problem, because regrettably, we have a long list, a long theory of environmental problems. So tax bases, as fiscal people say, we have a long list to propose.
Thanks, Aldo. Indeed, yes, we would, in a way, love to see a moment where those revenues are decreasing because the environmental problems have been resolved. And also thanks to Ernst for mentioning this example of the reform in Germany, which contrasts clearly with the Gilets jaunes example, because there was a question from the audience about, clearly in some countries, if you increase the overall tax level, you might want to decrease it at the same time as you do that shift internally. But clearly, if I'm a finance minister from a member state and looking at the current situation, it looks a little bit like the perfect storm for that. So maybe to go back on this issue, there's a question from the audience about why is progress so slow? Saying we have been at this for so long. So what it is we can do that is new to speed things up? After all, we have, we know from science that we have a limited number of years to shift things around. So what would be your recommendations to those finance ministers about what they can do to really speed up the process? And also what recommendation to the von der Leyen Commission about what it is we can do to speed up the process? I must say also that some people on the chat are referring to, unanimity as one of the issues that needs to be touched on at the EU level. Then another question is around, the necessity to make a difference between what the person called lifestyle emissions or luxury emissions versus essential needs. And how do we make sure that tax systems or other measures accompanying tax reform will make sure that we redress that fundamental inequality? One final element for this batch of questions relates to what you have been mentioning, some of you, about investors. And it talks about a new report on net zero from McKinsey, which shows that Europe needs 29 trillion of investments until 2050. And currently only 50% of these investments have so-called standalone business cases, which means that private investors will not be funding these projects unless and until they have the right incentives. So can you also talk about what you think, and you mentioned this also, Paul Tang, the importance of the taxonomy, but what sort of role tax reform could play in shifting private finance towards those investments that are very much needed? Who wants to kickstart? I always start with Paul.
It's fine. I think it's a good question. Why is it sometimes so difficult to get change? We know that in a sense it's obvious that the problem of climate change is clear, but why are we so slow to act? And I take it from my when I look back at my political career, I remember that I started the national parliament and we had some tax instruments introduced, for example, on a tax on airplane tickets, and a tax on packaging. And they were quickly abolished, in fact. So you see that if you take a piecemeal approach, it's sometimes very difficult because you get a resistance from this particular sector. For example, the tax on airplane tickets gets the pushback from the airline companies and the airports. And this is why I'm more optimistic, because we see a momentous change in many aspects. It's not just the tax system that we can change, but it's also the shift we see in public expenditure, but also in private investment. And I think that's very interesting. And maybe I'm too optimistic, right? I'm a politician. I can't do my job if I'm not optimistic. So maybe I'm too optimistic. But I also fear a change in private investments. I've been working on what's called sustainable finance, how to make the financial sector sustainable. And I think that's important because the investors play a crucial role in the direction that the corporates are taking. And what you see is that what is called ESG investment is taking priority at this stage. So every financial institute is now working on ESG. They even call it a mega trend. Well, it's a mega trend, then it must be is part of mainstream business. And this has been the intention all along, to make it mainstream in the thinking of corporates and their investors. And so maybe I'm too optimistic, but what I see is a change in many aspects of our economy and society. And so it doesn't have to be the taxation that takes the lead, because we want this price signals through these markets. It's also that we see the shift in public investment, which provide new opportunities. We see the shift in corporate lives and in investment practices, and altogether it will make, that's my conviction, it will make it easier to make this change. But okay, maybe that's my hope, and but that's what I think also.
Well, I actually share your optimism, and also I think we also need to compare the risk with remaining with the current taxation system, where the tax base is eroding, and where I don't think it would be particularly popular to be yet increasing again labor taxes. So I think if I were a finance minister, I would compare the two risks, but there's not a risk-free option, so to speak, unfortunately. Ernst.
There are two opponents against environmental taxation. One is the representatives of the poor, has been said, and the other is the representative of certain industries. They have two very, very different motives. So the answers of dealing with this slowness have to be different. For companies, I believe it is important to really become constructive in a border tax adjustment, so that foreign companies cannot beat the domestic companies just because they don't do a green tax. This is a very difficult task for the trade commissioner in negotiations with the WTO and others. This is something a bit outside our topic of today, but it has to be kept in mind. And then if you are successful in that, you will have the entire community of investors on your side, which is extremely important. On the poor people, there are various measures avoiding the gilet jaune by saying, well, for the first basic part, there is no tax, period. They did that in South Africa. After apartheid, they massively increased the price of water and energy, but ground level was tax-free, and it worked well. So that is one thing you can do. And then you can differentiate in the consumption tax between luxury and less luxury. So these are things of details which can be done nationally, but also the EU can make the frame conditions. That, I believe, is quite good. But another point I'd like to mention at this case, because international trade was mentioned by Paul, rightly so, I think we have to be more active as a European Union in trying to agree on trade rules against the tax havens. The OECD is active in that, and that is very good. It has to be strengthened and perhaps reinvent the so-called Tobin tax, the money transfer tax, which was invented by James Tobin 50 years ago or so, but it was always meant as a source of a lot big money. This was the mistake, because that would lead to a complete blocking by Wall Street and the London cities, etc. But today's speculation mathematics, computerized speculation, works the way that within 1 millisecond, billions of dollars or euros are traded across the world. If you introduce a very tiny Tobin tax, let me say 1/1,000,000%, then good speculation would not be hit at all, while the computerized algorithms, which are destroying reasonable trade, would be punished. Because if in a millisecond billions are traded, then even a millionth of the percent would become very expensive, and thereby more or less phase out, abolish the kind of crazy speculation that is presently distorting ordinary world trade, according to David Ricardo.
Thanks, Ernst, and also thank you for mentioning the Tobin tax. As you know, it's back on the agenda, so the financial transaction tax is back on the agenda, and indeed those points are really important, and they were already mentioned also by Sandrine, that yes, environmental taxation, but we also need to look at other types of new taxation as we're faced with an erosion of the tax base. Aldo?
Well, on the problem of historical awareness of problems, I mean, the Club of Rome started to work seriously in 68-72. It needed 50 years to have a general, almost general consensus on their analysis and intuitions. On climate, we now have a very large majority, but not everybody is still convinced. So we need time to build solutions overall when we have to apply them in the political arena. I think that we needed time for climate, we needed time for biodiversity, which is more difficult to explain. We need time for the pandemics to be understood, as we are in the middle of a crisis, and we risk other pandemics probably because of the anthropic impact on ecosystems that we have had. May I remind that yesterday the Dasgupta report on the economics of biodiversity was issued, and I think it's an important contribution, saying that natural capital ecosystems must be valued. They don't necessarily need a price, but they need an evaluation and estimation and be integrated into decision making. Then I would just like to add the idea of communication, which was raised. Obviously, when we introduce or reinforce environmental taxation, and it is still very low at the moment, I must say, in the fiscal systems, we have to offer a package. We have to offer compensation when it is needed. We have subsidies which are helping vulnerable groups. Let's talk about agriculture, let's talk about goods, trucks, transport, let's talk about the poor, those in need Obviously, politically, we want to decide to help them, but it's not a good idea to help them through environmentally harmful subsidies. We have to help them through transparent subsidies where they can decide what to do, not underpricing water, electricity, carbon emissions, and so on. This is absolutely a key, I think, in the communication. The French Gilets jaunes are often quoted. I think it was a matter of communication because colleagues from the ministries of ecology and finance had prepared good compensation measures, but apparently it was forgotten to announce them in an effective way. We don't want to punish anybody. We want to have a more ecologically sustainable development-oriented fiscal system.
Thanks a lot, Aldo. Clearly, the communication issue is always a very important one to remember. And one person from the audience is pointing out that maybe instead of framing environmental taxation as a punishment for polluters, we could also frame it as a way to prevent further damage, which I think is an interesting thought. But the final batch of questions, one person is mentioning the potential key role for the circular economy, because if you're able to reduce labor taxation, you are able actually to create more jobs, because you are getting to a point where business models, new business models, can emerge because it's becoming economically feasible to be doing certain things that currently are not within the circular economy. So if the panel could think about, okay, looking also at the opportunity linked with reducing labor taxes as well as increasing taxes on, for instance, dumping glass, I think, is one of the issues where in many countries it's much cheaper to actually dispose of glass than to do anything with it in the industry. So thinking about this as a way to help the circular economy would be one of the questions. There's also someone mentioning that should we be taxing products? Is that the right approach? Or what are we taxing if we're not taxing products, given that obviously from product to product, it's very complex to actually figure out how much a product is polluting. So what's your thinking about that? And then a lot of comments and questions around, how do we make this just for the poor? And you started to answer. Some are mentioning, how about an earth dividend? Where you actually redistribute, you earmark and redistribute in lump sum transfers to the poorest population? Or should you instead go for reducing labor taxation? Or should you still keep a portion for green investment? Or should you do like most finance ministers would want to do, not earmark it and use it to just balance the budget? What would be your thoughts also about the issue of earmarking it in a way that is fair, but will also convince finance ministers? Paul?
Well, let's hope that we don't have ministers of finance 1 or 2 years from now that start balancing the budget or to reduce government debt, that we go back to the policy of austerity, and because I think that would be relatively disastrous. And I don't think that is the situation. I think people are, because this is the second crisis in a short time, are very much aware that at the end of the day, after the crisis will come the question, who will pick up the bill? And I don't think that people are at this time ready to say, okay, we pick up the bill again. So that's why I'm pretty optimistic on the tax agenda, that will be able to fight tax avoidance, but also to make the tax system more sustainable. Because it has a logic, but it's also a fair proposal. We don't want the bill to be picked up by the big corporates that don't pay their taxes. We want the bill to be picked up by the big polluters that don't pay for their pollution right now. I think that's a proposition that is that will be shared broadly, because that's a proposition of fairness that is shared throughout the political spectrum. So when it comes to how to make sure that the poor do not that do not start to resist because they feel they are, let's say, the victim of these changes. I've already said it's not just about the monetary compensation they get. It's also about the order in which we take on. So if we start with the big polluters first, that makes much more sense than when we start with the households, right? So that's also important. But maybe I'm a classic social democrat, but I would expect that you would have monetary compensation through the income tax system. But that we may need to add to this income tax system is an earned income tax credit or a basic income, that you at least let people have an income as compensation, and that comes from the fact that we start to tax environmentally damaging activities, because it's not the product, it's the activities that we think is damaging. So we have if we have a carbon tax, we also have a carbon dividend. Make sure that the carbon dividend goes to the households in a fair way and in the form of earned income tax credit or a basic income. That would be, for me, the right way to start. And like I said, this should be done at the same time, right? So that there's a link between the shift towards environmental taxation, but also at the same time that there is compensation in a fair way.
I'm fully on the side of Paul. That's wonderful, including the overall tax revenues. I've lived in America for 6 years of my life and saw America degrading and splitting. I mean, Joe Biden is not to be, has an extremely difficult job in a country which hates taxes anyway. This is crazy. It destroys civilization. So thank you. But then the next point is Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, gave a wonderful speech in December at Columbia University, in which he explicitly asks for the shift of tax burden from income to carbon and from taxpayers to polluters. So that has reached the highest level of political considerations. I like that very much. But let me make one particular point. In the Bundestag, in the German parliament, I was also chairman of the Special Committee on Globalization. And one of the problems caused by globalization was that the rich were mobile and the poor are not, meaning that consumption taxes are good for the exchequer, while taxing the rich are not, because they are disappearing. So we have to re-internationalize justice, which is a difficult task anyway. But in terms of tax revenues, it's imperative, unless and until we become more successful on that. And this mostly, I have to say, has to be fought by continental Europe against the English-speaking countries. The English-speaking countries love globalization, evidently, and they love tax havens. So there is a civilizational clash in the air, which has to be considered, even if we talk about environmental taxes.
Thanks, Serge, for bringing up the international element, and certainly maybe this is also something that Aldo can pick up on, because obviously at the level of the OECD, there's the BEPS process, other processes. So is there also potential for a greater international tax cooperation that would be directed to greening? And Aldo, if you want to pick any other issue.
Indeed, there is. I mean, if we act together, it's easier and more acceptable by public opinions. We mutually reinforce one another. If we work together in international fora like OECD or the different governments will have more support, and public opinions probably will accept it more easily. On circular economy, certainly the market-based instruments and environmental taxation can play a key role. I'm thinking to the work on resource efficiency and Factor 4 by von Weizsäcker and Emory Lovins. I'm thinking to the European Environment Agency, which has been working hard on this, and I'm thinking to the IRP, the International Resource Panel, which is always paying attention to these aspects. On the earmarking issue, as a public finance economist, I'm not very keen on earmarking in principle. Generally, the money doesn't have a color, but I think that in a transition period, earmarking is acceptable even for traditional economists like myself. So for the ecological transition, for the economy transition, for the Green Deal, for a determined number of years, we can use earmarking. And then we will have probably to have an alliance between environmental ecological ministers and finance economy ministers to find the right balance. I think there is space for all. And finally, on product taxation, yes, indeed, we have to come back from income taxation to product taxation. I think it's a line of action. It's extremely important that we can announce decreasing labor taxation in a significant and ambitious matters. The communication must not be on a new carbon tax, on our new rates in taxes. It must be that we are abating labor taxation, something which is visible and appreciated overall by vulnerable citizens.
Thanks a lot, Aldo. I mean, it's time now for your final remarks. I'll give you about, 1 minute to give your final key recommendation to this amazing audience. You have about what you think is the top priority. Where do we start from today to get this going? And as you're thinking about your top line, I also want to make sure that people are not too frustrated because the panel is not answering questions about what the Commission is intending to do. I know that some of the colleagues from the Commission are responding to those questions on the chat. And immediately afterwards, we'll hear also from Gerasimus Thomas, who I'm sure will be giving us more details about what the Commission intends to do. So, but first, let's get the final top-line recommendation from our three amazing panelists, and starting again with Paul.
Well, I don't think it comes as a surprise. I think I've repeated that a bit through this session, that I would like to see us sustainability broad. Don't discuss just the greening of the taxation system. It's about the sustainability of the taxation system. And I think that we need to look at broadly also to make it sure that it will find social acceptance. And at the same time, it's even broader than taxation. There are other areas in which we see the changes, the public expenditure that's going towards sustainability, the change in the attitude of private investment. And I think there's an excellent opportunity to make the change towards sustainability in our economics and in our societies. And let's remain optimistic. I really loved the plea by Ernst Ulrich on the Tobin tax. Sometimes different ideas are much stronger and will survive. And there will come a point in time that we indeed will have a Tobin tax. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ernst?
3 points. Compensation for the poor, as the Swiss and the Swedes and even the Canadians do, in particular regarding the carbon tax. Second, some kind of a gradualism, but long-term predictable, so that each year there is no harm, but investors know where the future is. And third, do include raw materials in order to support the circular economy. My friend Anders Wickman from Sweden, with whom I was co-chairing the Club of Rome, has done wonderful studies of the positive employment effect of circular economy. And this should be supported by a good tax system.
Thank you very much, Ernst. Aldo?
I only have to add one thing, is that ecological fiscal reforms or environmental or green fiscal reforms, removing environmentally harmful subsidies, introducing serious and ambitious carbon pricing are not the solution, but they are part of the solution. We cannot do without it. And if we do it in a general complex approach, but effective approach, we can advance on ecological and sustainable development policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aldo. Thank you really, really from the bottom of my heart to all the panelists. I think people are also commenting in the chat how great a session this has been, and that's thanks to you. What a wealth of experience and knowledge you've brought, but also a lot of optimism, which we really need as we set forward in what I hope, is the start of a moment by which, by 2030, we will have reached 10% or if not even more of total tax revenues coming from taxing polluters. So thanks a lot. And now we will turn to another distinguished speaker, Gerasimos Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are the Director General of DG TaxSud, so you have indeed a lot of hot tax files on your desk at the moment. You've had a distinguished career before in your home country as a Deputy Minister for Environment and Energy. You've also been in so many places in the Commission in DG NR, DG ECFIN. You also had a role as the chairman of the European Fund for Strategic Investment until 2019. So we're really excited to hear what you have to tell us about the Commission plans regarding all the different tax files. And I know that the audience is particularly keen to hear about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also the energy tax directive. Gerasimos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and good morning to all of you. And thank you very much for inviting me to this. The issue discussed is very close to my heart and to my career over the last 10 years. In taxation, I'm new, as you probably all know. I just joined in last August in this position. So this is still the time for me to listen, and I try to listen to let's say this conference from the very beginning and follow the chat. So very enriching debate for me, and a lot of things to learn and balance. I very much agree with Paul's comment that a lot of the success on what we will do in the future hinges on the sequencing, the timing of these reforms, and the communication of these reforms. I also agree very much with Sandrine in what she said on, we need a holistic approach. We need to look at the green taxation as an integral part of a broader fiscal agenda that prepares and adapts our tax systems to the green era that we are going to enter. And I very much agree also with Ernst Ulrich and Aldo that the international dimension should be very much anchored in our thinking, because at the end of the day, saving the planet is a job for the international community, the global community. Now, I think the Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, and is taking this approach at heart, and that's why we are preparing a big package, the Fit for 55 package that Executive Vice President Timmermans will present in June. We are looking, 12 measures that will address different fields: transport, energy efficiency, the reform of the ETS at the very core of this package, and of course the energy taxation directive and carbon border adjustment mechanism, on which I will share with you some more details later on. But let me first say a few words on the green taxation reform today, that and then respond a little bit to the discussion that you had today and summarize. Difficult to summarize such a rich discussion, but I think it is clear that green taxation can contribute to achieving environmental goals. And it is clear that certain economic activities are not resource efficient, cause harm to the environment and to biodiversity. And those who waste resources and damage the environment have to face consequences. I think green taxes therefore play an important part in the overall policy mix, who has different instruments, and it will use over the next 10 years in Europe different instruments: pricing, subsidies, standards, investment in public infrastructure, and the market functioning of the ETS. It is important for the Commission going forward, to make sure that our proposals have the right analytical base. I was very interested on the study that it was presented to us today. This is a fundamental component of all the knowledge that the Commission is accumulating before making its full proposals in June. And so are 3 other studies that I would mention. We did a study on energy tax indicators. We also have done a study with member states on good practices and design elements of different energy tax systems. And then we are doing some research together with DG Environment on environmentally harmful subsidies. It is important for us that in all our analytical work in the Commission, I wouldn't say for the first time, but I would say for the first time, without any exception, all the responsible departments, the DGs in the Commission, will closely work together, and they share all the analysis modeling work across each other. So there will be cross consistency. There is a great, let's say, consensus around the need to work together across policy areas in the Commission in this field. The second issue, I would say, and it was mentioned by many, is that taxation can contribute to the green recovery, and this can start today, at least at member state level. No QMV required, and I think the member states in the framework of recovery and resilience facility, they have an opportunity to address, the issue of and tax reform. They can make use of environmental taxes in a broader framework going forward, and of course use the RRF as an instrument to support investment. And as you know, RRF has a public but also has a private component through guarantees and the Invest in You. So RRF is overlooked as an instrument that can allow us to boost green investment and address issues related to green taxation today, and provide the basis for the longer term reform. Behavioral changes can start at the member states level, and issues of fairness and can be addressed through RRF already. We do have the instruments on this. Now, I would say on the green policy initiatives, it is we are not in a very good starting point, and I will say why in a few minutes in the ETD. But we also do not have too much time. I mean, we have to do the sequencing and the timing right, but in a certain way, if green tax policy initiatives, they do not yield the results by 2035 or so, somewhere in the next and the middle decade, I mean, it will all be too late. Well, the target is to be carbon free by 2050. So the timing of the reforms and the way we move from where we are today to somewhere in the middle of the next decade is quite important, and it is challenging. But we do have an agreement by all heads of states that the 55% new target for 2030, it is necessary. We have the political backing up, and this is important. We also I would also say that at the core of our policy, it is the ETS reform. This is the flagship climate change mitigation instrument that we have. And the others, I would say, are supporting this. There are satellites around this core flagship instrument. Now, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is important for our climate diplomacy and long-term goal. We have to incentivize third countries to adopt more climate ambitious policies, move towards cleaner production processes, and we have an instrument that incentivizes the producers, not only the countries, and this is very important. We also have to ensure that the carbon leakage, risk of carbon leakage is avoided, to ensure that the efforts of our industries and other industries in countries, like-minded countries, reduce carbon emissions, and they do not, our efforts are not set off by opposite efforts and emissions elsewhere. So I think we are going ahead with a proposal on a carbon border emission adjustment mechanism. We will make sure that this is WTO compatible, that it is closely integrated with the ETS, so that the price signals of the ETS are strengthened by this instrument and not weakened by parallel mechanisms that are, have different pricing, let's say, characteristics. I think there is a discussions about sectors. We are looking at sectors, at raw materials to be introduced in the first place, but then eventually a possibility would be to expand the sectors without changing the design of the instrument. So we need to have an instrument that survives over the medium term and gives certainty for the industry to make investments. So we are going to have a design of the instrument that will be stable over time, but sectors can be added as we move along from 2023 onwards. On the Energy Taxation Directive, let's say the main objective is to align, this directive that was last time updated in 2003 with the new ambitions that on energy and climate policy that we have as part of the EU Green Deal. The ambitions have been increasing over the last years, and they get a final boost with the Green Deal, but the Energy Taxation Directive is stuck in the all time, I would say, almost, in the previous century. And, I think this is, it has lost its relevance. We had made a proposal back in 2011 to update it, and it was victim of the QMV, let's say, problem that you all highlighted. Now, what are the main problems? The problems is that de facto, the current Energy Taxation Directive subsidizes fossil fuel use. It is not in line with our ambitions, and the minimum rates are irrelevant. They are much lower than the actual effective rates in the member states as we speak. So in the beginning, the whole idea was that the minimum tax rates made a safety net, preserving, let's say, preventing the race to the bottom across member states, and preventing distortions, in the internal market with moving of certain, fuels across borders. But at the moment, in all areas, the minimum, let's say, rates and included in the directive are below the effective rates in the member states, and this is very bad. Now, another issue is that the Energy Taxation Directive still treats, fuels according to volume and not according to energy efficiency and energy content, and that way, in a certain way, it discriminates renewable fuels in favor of conventional fuels, particularly fossil fuels. We are therefore preparing to revise the directive to address these major faults. There are no decisions made. The proposals will come in June, but I think our reflection include various aspects. Of course, one is to increase the rates from where they are today, and also envisage a trajectory on how these rates will move over time in order to avoid, let's say, distributional aspects hitting specific sectors or parts of the population. Distributional effects are very important. So we need to have a trajectory. But beyond, let's say, the rates itself, I think it is probably important, and that's what we are analyzing, to move from volume to energy content, and so that you know, this creates provides the right let's say, incentives to the so-called green energy sector and penalties to the black energy sector. I think that you know, we need to update and streamline the list of products. There is a very big complexity and a lot of exemptions around the products that need to be addressed. And of course, we need to pay attention on a specific sector. It was mentioned, the role of agriculture, the role of transport, the role of maritime and aviation, and the challenges that these sectors are facing. Some of them, because of the pandemic, might require specific attention. But at the end of the day, the goal that we want to achieve has been set up by the heads of state and government, you know, by consensus in December, 55%. And therefore, the Energy Taxation Directive has to make its own contribution to make sure, you know, that through this taxation, we incentivize the new sectors, and we, in a certain way, bring some order to the incentives on the fossil fuels, and we penalize effectively fossil fuels as we move forward. I think this is an ambitious agenda. The QMV discussion was mentioned by you, and Paul gave, I think, some flavor of what's going on. I mean, the role of the Parliament, of the European Parliament, in forming political consensus around these issues is very important. I think the numbers are convincing to the European Parliament. They are convincing to the member states. We see an important move around these issues, and I think with good articulated proposals, I think we can convince. And there are probably some parts of the package that will, you know, might technically escape the QMB cost, let's say, clauses, but at the end of the day, we need a wider consensus to move forward in a holistic approach. So I think it is important for the Commission, and you know, we will address for the long term the issue of QMB. But I think in the framework of the rapid action that we need for climate now, I think we will also try to move by conviction and by putting let's say, the right policy proposals on the table. And now, as Paul, I want to be optimistic. My experience is that this is an area that you can convince people, and I think on the international front, we have good news. I mean, we do have good news from the new US administration that just joined the Paris Agreement. We do have good news from China, Japan, South Korea, South Africa. I think we need, you know, the urgency of addressing the issues related to the environment, but also on the taxation front. I mean, there are some of these like-minded countries that are discussing with us the carbon border adjustment mechanism as a way to have similar mechanisms, not only as some of them they want to oppose it, but some of them they want to endorse it and use similar mechanisms going forward. So I think one has to remain positive. One has to draw on the enthusiasm of you who have now the speakers in the panel, and all of those of you that participate there. I think we need to take the facts, and it's very important to have the facts and the numbers on our side, and I'm positive that we will be able to move ahead. Thank you very much for this, and thank you for participating.
Thank you so much, Director General, and thank you also for being optimistic, but reminding us about the urgency of time. We have indeed a declining window of opportunity for change, but we have great opportunities as the RRF. As you said, the strengthening of the ETS at the same time as exploring how to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and very importantly, the energy taxation directive, which for the moment, as you said, effectively subsidizes fossil fuel, and obviously which needs to be made Paris and carbon neutrality compatible. So we're really counting on you and wishing you a lot of strength for all the difficult discussions ahead as you try to build consensus for such an ambitious reform agenda. So thank you very much. I also want to, this is now the end of our event. So I really want to thank everyone who participated in the success of this event. My team, but also all the members from the consortium, DG Environment, DG TaxSud, many, obviously our panelists. I also want to highlight that DG Reform was in touch with us and is very keen to continue also doing their parts to help member states go through the reforms that they need to in the post-COVID era. I know that many participants would like the Q&A to be available afterwards, so we'll see what we can do. But certainly it's very exciting to me to see so many experts sharing papers, sharing best practice, sharing ideas live in the chat. So you've been really fantastic. In terms of the next steps for IEEP and the project, we will be organizing further workshops, so please watch the space, 2 of which will examine the design of specific taxes in more details, and 1 which will be focusing on a toolkit to help stakeholders become more politically, more involved in making the case for, and sometimes politically involved, helping to design green taxation. And we will publish the dates of those workshops on IEEP website, and I'm sure also on the DG Environment website as soon as we know them. And to close, I think we are still over 260 participants, which for a virtual event of 2 hours is quite amazing. So thank you so much for your dedication. I know so many of you have been battling for years on those topics, and for all your creativity as we try to build a movement that will contribute to build a new consensus towards a more fair, a more resilient tax system, which also addresses pollution and allows us to, save our planet and save ourselves, really. So I'd like to finish with saying, if not now, then when? And if not us, then who? And I very much wish you a good end of the day. Keep safe, watch the space, and let's make it happen together. Thank you.